There is a moment that almost nobody talks about, a quiet threshold, sitting somewhere between surviving and actually beginning to live differently. And it doesn't happen when you buy something expensive. It doesn't happen when you pay off a debt. It happens when you look at your bank account and realize the number there could absorb a genuine emergency without destroying you. $20,000 is not wealth by any conventional definition. Financial media rarely celebrates it. It doesn't make for dramatic headlines the way $1,000,000 does. But the psychological shift that occurs around this number is, in many ways, more profound than anything that happens at a higher threshold. Because it is the first time in most people's lives that money stops being a source of constant low-grade fear and begins quietly and almost invisibly to work in an entirely different way. To understand why this number matters, you first have to understand what life looks like below it. When your savings sit beneath a few $1,000s, every financial decision you make is subtly distorted. Economists call it scarcity mindset. It's a cognitive state documented extensively in behavioral research, most notably by Mullainathan and Shafir, who found that financial scarcity consumes mental bandwidth, the same way a loud noise in the background makes it harder to concentrate. You're not less intelligent when you're financially stressed, but a measurable portion of your cognitive capacity is perpetually occupied, running quiet calculations. What happens if the car breaks down, if the landlord raises rent, if a medical bill arrives unexpectedly? This is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of discipline. It is a neurological response to genuine instability, and it costs people an enormous amount of clarity without them ever realizing it. What changes at $20,000 is not simply that you have more money. It's that you've crossed for the first time what psychologists call the anxiety threshold, the point at which your savings can absorb the most common financial emergencies without requiring debt, without borrowing from family, without a cascading series of impossible trade-offs. The average unexpected car repair costs between $800 and $3,000. A single emergency room visit can run $5,000. A sudden job loss requires months of living expenses just to navigate cleanly. $20,000 doesn't make you immune to these events, but when they happen, and statistically they will, you respond to them as problems to be solved, rather than crises that threaten the entire architecture of your life. This shift has compounding psychological effects that most financial education completely ignores. When you're no longer operating in a state of low-level emergency, your relationship to risk changes fundamentally. People with thin savings buffers avoid career risks. They avoid entrepreneurial experiments. They avoid salary negotiations, not because they lack ambition, but because the downside of failure is catastrophically high when there's no cushion to land on. The person who stays in a job that underpays them by 30% is often not staying out of comfort. They're staying out of rational fear. The fear that a gap in income, even a short one, could trigger a chain of events they cannot recover quickly. $20,000 doesn't eliminate that risk, but it changes its character entirely. It transforms an existential threat into a manageable setback, and that transformation quietly expands the range of decisions you're willing to make. The mathematics of this threshold interact with the broader economy in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Debt, particularly high-interest consumer debt, functions as a tax on poverty, a mechanism by which people who can't afford to pay for things up front pay dramatically more for them over time. A person carrying $5,000 in credit card debt at 22% interest is paying over $1,000 per year simply for the privilege of having needed that money when they didn't have it. When your savings cross $20,000, you gain the ability to pay for emergencies in cash rather than credit. You stop paying that compounding penalty, and the money that was going to lenders begins to stay in your account instead, accelerating your savings in a way that feels almost disproportionate to the effort. There's also a behavioral dimension economists describe as the wealth effect. Not the macroeconomic version, but the personal psychological version, where people who feel financially stable make systematically better long-term decisions than people who feel financially precarious. They invest more in their health, their skills, their relationships, not because they suddenly have better values, but because their cognitive horizon has expanded. Scarcity mindset compresses your time horizon. It makes the present feel urgent and the future feel abstract. Financial stability reverses that compression. It allows you to weigh long-term consequences more clearly and to make investments in yourself that don't pay off immediately, but pay off substantially over time. None of this means $20,000 is the destination, or that reaching it solves the deeper structural questions about how wealth is built across a lifetime. But what makes $20,000 uniquely important is that it represents the first genuine escape from reactive financial living. The first point at which you stop being defined, in your own mind and in your daily decisions, by what you cannot afford. It is the difference between a financial life spent putting out fires and a financial life in which you begin, for the first time, to build something deliberately, with patience, with intention. The people who understand this don't talk about it in terms of a number. They talk about it in terms of a feeling. A quiet steadiness that changes how they wake up in the morning, how they respond to professional setbacks, how they think about the next 5 years. That feeling is not luxury, and it is not wealth in the classical sense. It is simply the baseline psychological security that human beings allows to think clearly about the future. And the fact that it is not universally accessible says something important about the systems we have built and about the distance between the financial education most people receive and the financial reality most people actually live.